All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening here in the United States. Good morning, I guess, over in Europe. It's very early. Um, I'm glad we can have this talk. So, things are happening so fast that it's difficult to keep up with them. And obviously, there's the fog of war and all of this kind of stuff. We don't know what's going on. And in these kind of situations, it's almost like people start speculating or coming up with theories before the information is settled. And so I've already heard a lot of theories of, well, wow, this is what it seems like, but actually, this is a Putin plot or something like that. But anyway, let's get our hands around what is actually happening. So, Prigozhin is the leader of the private military contractor, um, perhaps aptly named the Wagner Group. Uh, I've been a fan of Wagnerian opera for some time, and I was always waiting for a brutal military occupational force to honor the great composer, and here it is. And they've exceeded expectations. Who knows? A Wagnerian a Wagner admirers might soon rule Russia after deposing Putin. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves, but there have been back and forth between Shoigu, who's the defense minister of the Russian Federation, and the Wagner Group for some time. Prigozhin has made these bombastic videos that get shared around where he is inching closer, he was inching closer towards treason in every new video that he released. He was claiming that the defense minister was not giving them enough ammunition. He would release videos standing in front of a field of bodies and saying all these good men have died because of Russia. They don't want to really win this fight. The idea that you as a military commander in the field would criticize the government in this harsh way is fairly unthinkable. I mean, you will be relieved of your duties immediately if you do that in most campaigns. Um, you could do that behind the scenes, of course, but even the kind of vehemence with which Prigozhin launched these attacks seemed to be a bit much. Prigozhin and Putin go way back, and they seem to have a very strong working relationship. Uh, Prigozhin was actually accused, I had forgotten this, or maybe I hadn't connected the dots. Prigozhin was actually accused of starting the IRA. So there's this, and I'm not referring to the Irish Republican Army, I'm referring to the Internet Research Agency or whatever it is. It's based in St. Petersburg, and it has become notorious and probably overestimated to a degree, but it's certainly notorious as a troll farm that was pro-Trump, pro-lockup Hillary, anti-Trump, alt-right, all that kind of thing during the 2016 campaign. It was spreading memes, ginning up chaos. Maybe if there was some kind of consistent ideological quality to it, it was demoralizing the United States and demoralizing NATO, for which Trump was a vehicle. But he actually has been accused of being a part of that. But nevertheless, he and Putin go way back. They have connections in Syria, etc. So the notion that this is anti-Putin does seem, at least at first glance, rather incredible. But it might very well be. There have been reports I was just reading before I started this space of Google News being banned in Russia at the moment. It's being turned off by internet providers, effectively. There are tanks in the streets. Again, I don't know what to make of all this. But Prigozhin has made a claim that isn't just, you're stabbing us in the back, you are letting our men die out in the field because we don't have enough ammunition. or some of his other claims, like you're not fighting hard enough. We can do this if you would only let us win. He's moved towards accusing Shoigu of actually bombing Wagner mercenary forces. So he is accusing him of a grand crime. Now, to be fair to Prigozhin, I think there's a little bit of plausibility here. Does Shoigu see the Wagner group as no doubt effective, or at the very least brutal, but is more trouble than it's worth? Here you have this weirdly charismatic, angry man who has fans on the internet, and all of his videos get reported on and dissected and all that kind of stuff. Here you have this man who really is threatening the consistency of power. He's criticizing the government vehemently while fighting. Is this guy more trouble than he's worth? So what I'm suggesting is, might Prigozhin be actually telling the truth here? Might Shoigu have done this? I don't think it's out of the range of possibilities. Is this a kind of feint or something like this? This is something else to think about. So the much lauded new offensive in 2023, which was launched by Ukraine after the snow thawed, hasn't lived up to expectations. We haven't seen dramatic gains, at least in territory, at the moment. And that's at least been the spin on it that I've read in mainstream sources, where headlines will be something like, defense officials claim that Ukraine offensive isn't living up to expectations, or something like that. There hasn't been this dramatic reversal. We've also, heard a lot of tough talk of, if Ukrainians begin attacking Crimea, which has been effectively under Russian sovereignty since 2014, they will hold NATO responsible. That will be considered a direct attack on Russia by NATO forces. It's not just NATO countries supporting plucky Ukraine. It is NATO directly attacking something that was antebellum Russian. And so there's talk again of nuclear war. That flared up last year. It's kind of died down. It's flaring up again. So we're just in this morass. Is Ukraine stalling? Are we just seeing the beginnings of an offensive? Is in fact Russia losing? Prigozhin has accused Shoigu of, being responsible for the deaths of 100,000 men or something like that. Well, if that's true, I don't know exactly what he's saying. Maybe it's just hyperbole, but are the Russian losses actually much greater than the somewhat conservative estimates that, at least the last time I checked, would put it in the 100,000 to 150,000 range? Is this real? Is this Putin using his old friend Prigozhin, they go way back, to knock off an internal rival, Shoigu? So this is some elaborate feint where Shoigu will actually, engage in some kind of attack on Russia, but it will only be in order to, bolster Putin's power. That's all possible. So anyway, I wanted to ask some people up. If you'd like to get in here, feel free. As you can tell, I am working off the scant information that we had, and I'm engaging in some speculation. So if you have more thoughts on the matter, please jump in. Okay, I'll go to Xbox soon. I'll go first to, Kenny, Syphilis Kenny. I can't believe him. Yes. Do you have something to say?
Are you a faggot?
Goodbye. All right. I should have known that, to be honest. Okay, Xbox, what's up?
Yeah, well, he made a really good point, but I wanted to follow up on that. Yeah, so I was just I didn't have anything particular I wanted to say. Just wanted to jump into the speaker list, but um, like you said, I mean, it's almost impossible to know what's happening right now. I know that the supposed Wagner convoy that I heard was 50 kilometers long, after hearing it was 12 kilometers long, has entered Rostov. There's like no visual confirmation of it. So it's not even clear that Prigozhin has the support of Wagner. He may. He claimed that he has 25,000 troops marching to Moscow, and that he claims the majority of the Russian military sympathizes with him, which, I mean, of course, he would say that. Um, uh,
Famous last words, perhaps, as well.
right. So yeah, I mean, it's like fog of war. I don't really know what's going on. Um, one thing that I did want to say is the comment that you made. I saw attributed to Prigozhin as well. He claims that Shoigu is responsible for 100,000 Russian deaths. Um, that seems like a vast overestimate. I think that like the BBC claims that the actual Russian casualty figure is closer to 25,000 dead. Obviously, more wounded. Um,
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of odd. I also think that Prigozhin's claim, like he makes it out as though Russia is being devastated in the war, which is strange at this moment when Russia's held up relatively well during this Ukrainian counteroffensive. Um, so that's odd. I mean, John Mearsheimer gave a talk like a month ago on the state of the conflict, and he, obviously, I wouldn't say he's a Russian shill. He's not pro-Russian. Um, just fairly anti-Russian. He's kind of an American, um, you know, uh, hegemonic apologist, I guess. But he seems to think that the long-term prospects of a Russian victory in the war are very good, largely due to differences in artillery shell production, which is like the Russians are. It's primarily an artillery-based conflict. The Russians are outstripping NATO in producing shells. So I don't know. I find Prigozhin's behavior very odd. It's just like I mean, like even if this is some kind of 4D chess thing, which I'm very skeptical of, like it
Yeah.
seems to damage Russia's internal like domestic legitimacy, its standing in the world. Um, I don't know. It's very strange. Prigozhin also seems like he has very little hopes of success. Like even Western analysts today are generally assuming that Prigozhin will be dead by the end of the weekend. So yeah, I don't know. Very strange.
Yes. One thing that I would suggest, I kind of a bigger picture thing that I want to talk about. But before I would suggest this. So I've been reading the same reports you have, and you know, all we have is this. We have like Defense Department, uh, you know, tells CNN that Ukraine ain't looking too great in the offensive. You know, you have basically these official reports and so on. I think in terms of a long battle of attrition, I mean, you could definitely make a plausible argument that Russia will win that. Um, that NATO also might get cold feet in the matter and want to withhold support if a, say, Republican wins or so. I mean, these are all plausible arguments, even if I don't quite agree with them. But there is the possibility that things are a lot worse than we know. I mean, defense analysts also thought that Kiev would fall in 2 weeks. And they were saying as such, at least some of them were. Some of them were wildly optimistic. Some of them were saying that early on. Certainly, a lot of independent analysts were saying that. So there is a possibility that this is entirely genuine. And that, I mean, of course, Prigozhin is a madman. I mean, he's a mercenary leader of this, wildly violent paramilitary organization. I mean, it's not too much to say that he is a bold figure, but he might be on to something. That Russia might be weaker than we can tell just by looking at the front line. And Mersheimer might very well make a good case, but where is these numbers coming from? I mean, I don't know. I would just suggest that. I think that's a possibility. And so this is actually very real. We're watching history unfold, similar to when, Gorbachev was kidnapped and put into DACA for a little bit and all that kind of stuff. So it's definitely, that is definitely a possibility. The bigger picture item. Well, actually, do you want to respond to that before I get to the bigger picture item?
Um, I had another speculation about Prigozhin's motives, but
Okay,
no,
go for it.
you can go on to the bigger picture item first.
No, you go first, actually.
Yeah, one thing, so I hopped in a little bit late, so I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but kind of an interesting speculation on Prigozhin's motives is that I believe as of July 1st, every member of Wagner was going to be required to sign a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense, which would be one of the first steps to integrating Wagner into the Russian military. And some people are speculating that, I mean, Prigozhin overtly opposed this, and Shoigu was very much in favor of it. And some people are speculating that perhaps this is Prigozhin kind of like announcing his opposition to losing his PMC empire and it being essentially nationalized. So it's kind of like, the loss of the SA or something like that. So there might be just a more mundane political and kind of
Or
financial.
entirely personal kind of
Right.
grievance. Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Which seems
There's no
ridiculous
doubt.
because he's like,
I've
alive.
actually read that it is not legal to employ mercenary forces in a campaign under Russian law. Now, I've read that. I am not, obviously, I'm not an expert in these matters, but needless to say, these things don't really matter on some level. If you want to do it, you're going to do it as a head of state. But yeah, I mean, all of these things might play a role. Let me mention this before I go to Boris and then obvious. Let me just get my kind of broader theory out of the way, because I think we're in a very interesting situation. So think about our country, the United States. We are hyper polarized and hyper politicized to the point that everything is political. We have these endless presidential campaigns where, in effect, there's always a campaign going on throughout our lives. We're always getting ready for November, and everything is political. The Little Mermaid is a left-right issue. Gay pride is a left-right issue, etc. Everything. We're a hyper polarized and hyper politicized society. Russia is the opposite of that. It is a kind of depoliticized society. And I'm using, I'm using back of the envelope or guesstimates here, but it's almost like 2/3 of the population doesn't want to really think about any of this at all. And so a lot of people in the West, or people on Twitter with Ukrainian flags, etc., they were kind of waiting for the average Russian to stand up and say no to Putin or a general strike or something like this. Now, one of the reasons, and an important one, is that that person would be thrown in jail if he did that. Of course, it is a more oppressive, kind of overtly oppressive society. But I think the more fundamental reason is that Ivan doesn't give a shit, in fact. And he doesn't want to think about it, and he doesn't want it to touch him. And so the Russian people have, in effect, kind of allowed this non-ideological, kind of neither left nor right in many ways, autocrat in the figure of Putin, who's ambiguous and flat and emotionless, a patriot, that can be said, but what exactly he believes in is pretty dubious, to say the least. So you have a kind of depoliticized society. And so I think that played out in terms of the conception of the original invasion of Ukraine, where it was presented as a kind of police action and to denazify Ukraine, again, a somewhat ridiculous notion with some kernels of truth, a special military operation. Basically, Putin, on the one hand, made this out to be this grand historical effort. So he released an essay about the unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people a year or 6 months before the invasion, and this was about coming home again, Ukraine has no right to be separate, and we're going to bring everyone back into the family. So it was this, on one level, he had this historical ideology about what was happening. But on another level, it was a kind of special military operation to get rid of the Nazis. And he never fully mobilized the Russian people. Maybe he couldn't do that even if he wanted to. But that's definitely not his, as this kind of former KGB guy, a very flat person, that's not really his instinct to, go out there and get everyone fired up for total war or something like that. And so I do think we're in this odd situation where, the war has come home to Russia in a few ways. There was that, excursion by Russian nationalists who are fighting alongside Ukraine into Russia, which seems to have faded away. There was the apparent drone bombing of the Kremlin itself, which also has kind of faded away. Well, this, if you're an average Russian and you hear that there's a violent coup performed by a paramilitary force, I mean, this is shocking and terrifying. Like you can't avoid it. And so I think we're in this interesting situation where there are kind of multiple dynamics going on at the same time. There's Putin certainly wanting to win the war and willing to lose a huge amount of men in order to continue this campaign, and at the very least not to lose face. There's his unwillingness or even inability to mobilize the population in a way that 20th century leaders absolutely did. And then there's this kind of new terror of, is there actually a civil war? Are you going to have to choose sides? Is Russia collapsing? Are we, are we headed towards chaos? Which, at least if I were living in Moscow or anywhere in Russia, I would be thinking myself. So that's kind of how I think of where we are right now ideologically. Boris, do you want to jump in? Oh, Xbox. Yeah, Xbox, you can jump in after Boris. Yeah.
Well, Richard and everyone, I got caught a little flat-footed in this one. I was not able to take a deep dive; just didn't have time today, and kind of looked at a lot of stuff very quickly in the last hour, literally. Looked at some Russian language sources. And just a few data points that, or they may not be data points, but something that might contribute to the discussion. So first and foremost, Richard, I think to your point that things might be going worse or a lot worse than what is being presented or what is known. I listened to today's video address by General Surovikin, who was at some point the commander of the special military operation in Ukraine, and has since been appointed sort of a liaison between Wagner and the Ministry of Defense, the regular troops. It's unclear to what extent his role is kind of carries commanding authority, or if he's just a guy facilitating or kind of trying to prevent tensions between Wagner and the regular military. He let perhaps a slip of the tongue, but when he was talking about the need for putting aside all differences, and in this difficult time for our country, we cannot be doing this, meaning Wagner going back and asking for Shoigu's head, or we cannot be kind of pursuing different, even disagreements. He said something very odd. He said, I'm not quoting, but very close to quoting, as our soldiers are in the midst of a very difficult battle with exceeding forces of the enemy. I mean, this was very clear. He was referring that the Ukrainian forces opposing the Russians at the front lines exceed them in some way, but he didn't specify what. It, like I said, it might have been a slip of the tongue because it's kind of a cliche that people often use, but I thought it was interesting. The other thing that I wasn't quite aware of, but at one point or another in the last few months, bits and pieces kind of came up, and I wasn't sure how much weight to assign to them. But apparently, Wagner's core battle-capable units are now fully in control, or are fully controlled by the generals and officers of the general staff of the Russian military. So, and I've seen it from multiple sources, and the purported artillery attack on one of Wagner's bases today. Again, one source suggested that it might have been a retaliation against a similar artillery attack on another Wagner camp that was actually orchestrated by Prigozhin. As crazy as it may sound, it was a couple of months ago. That attack didn't get a lot of publicity, but the reason, or plausible reason, for that earlier attack is that at that time, at that base camp, there was a very significant number of Russian general staff officers who were there for some event, but they basically are the people who were going to command or were going to take control of the Wagner units that are kind of most battle capable. So Prigozhin purportedly had tried to eliminate those officers so he can assume fuller control of Wagner.
Wow.
And I couldn't tell from what I've heard. Today was the first time I heard about it. I don't know anything about it. I don't know if anyone was killed, but this was supposedly a retribution for it. So Prigozhin himself, after recording 3 video addresses this morning, which got a lot of publicity, obviously, hasn't been seen since, but multiple sources report that he's back in St. Petersburg. Also, I've seen footage that came from Russian language Telegram channels of, again, purportedly, no way to prove it, essentially combat taking place near Rostov, which is Russia proper. So presumably meaning that the Wagner troops moving, and they would be moving, and it was reported they're moving toward Rostov, which is the closest large city in Russia. They're coming through, and they're being met with deadly force by the regular Russian troops, so they're engaging in essentially a battle. And the footage certainly had that appearance. I've also seen a message of the Rostov governor addressed to I think it was on one of the Russian social media platforms, addressed to the residents of his oblast, the Rostov region, city and the surrounding area, urging people to stay calm and not come out of their houses without serious need. Again, it could be fake. I can't vouchsafe it. It was something that was forwarded to me. It looked genuine, but certainly in this day and age, it's very easy to manufacture stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean, this
So.
is just to add on that. I mean, the possibility of AI generated voice and even video is very real at this point, and it adds a whole other layer to this. But I've seen this confirmed so many places that I do believe it as well. I saw that same audio of Prigozhin telling, stay in your homes as we march through. I mean, it's pretty remarkable stuff. Do you think that Prigozhin, Boris, understands himself as a great man of history? Like the kind of person who would attempt something this grandiose?
I don't have a strong opinion on that. At some point, he might have thought of himself that way, but I am getting a stronger and stronger sense that the actions we are seeing from him as of late smack of desperation, smack of some attempt to survive through all this, rather than to put himself in a position of succeeding Putin or some other grandiose plan. Wagner itself clearly does not have the numbers and the military strength to affect that change, even a coup. I mean, it would be crushed. Not even on approach to Moscow, but fairly.
Sure.
As soon as they're seen as a clear present danger. And interestingly enough, Prigozhin himself has never. In any of his addresses that he's recorded in the past few months, where he just ranted and went off the rails about how horrible this campaign and how poorly it's been prosecuted. He never criticized Putin. Mm-hmm. And it's not really, I mean, the tactics they appear to be that he wants to drive a wedge between Putin and his military. And it's not that difficult, because even though Putin actually is much closer to Shoigu than he is with Prigozhin, he goes much farther back with Shoigu, and they vacation together, and they're pretty close. Prigozhin is not. I mean, his acquaintance with Putin was maybe 12, maximum 15 years ago, when Putin hosted Tony Blair at a St. Petersburg restaurant, and that was one of Prigozhin's restaurants at the time, and Prigozhin himself served them. And I think he did something similar. That he did the same when Schroeder was in town, and he also. So it's not the kind of relationship where most of Putin's cronies had served with him in the KGB in the Soviet days in the 80s or even the 70s. I mean, it's much more recent, and it's more circumstantial. So he had access to Putin. He had direct access to Putin. It seems that when he started his open confrontation with Shoigu, that access was lost. And that probably, I would say, if I were to pinpoint the moment in time, it was probably maybe January, February of this year. So he couldn't just request a meeting and be seen by Putin. And again, I don't pretend to understand the game he's playing. Obviously, he has a lot more information at his disposal. He knows what the risks and potential rewards are. My theory after Bakhmut was taken by Wagner was that this was his goal, and that from now on he probably sees the odds of a continued involvement by Wagner in Ukraine carrying diminishing returns. and that he would probably try to preserve the battle-capable units and retreat to his kind of core business of, protecting gold mines and oil fields in Africa, and kind of helping local strongmen fight off coup d'états or
Right.
actually effect those coups. So that may still happen. Again, my theory now is that he's seeing some clear and present danger to himself, and that might have provoked him into this desperate action, unless as some people believe, that it's just a very high production value reality show, that he's that nothing of the kind is happening. I've seen even one source suggest that this was all cleared with Patrushev. So
Interesting.
this morning. So again, who knows? But just thought I'd share this.
There were some interesting aspects. First off, in one of his addresses, he said that this war was started based on lies, and Vladimir Putin was given lies by his underlings, and so that such rhetoric seems to almost let Putin off the hook. It's kind of the if only the Pope knew what the wicked bishops are up to, or whatever the line. If only the Tsar knew what his ministers are up to, however it's phrased. It's basically a way of the top man who has ultimate responsibility is let off the hook, and it can be almost done on his behalf. I got that. That at the same time, he also mentioned, again, I'm not a Russian speaker, I'm just looking at a translation. He also mentioned, he told the Russian people, don't worry, we'll be back on the front soon. And government functions, including the presidential authority, will continue. So he didn't say Putin was going to be in office. It was almost like, don't worry, there'll be the office of the president will continue, which also struck me as a little odd. So I don't know. I mean, again, we just have to be like very non-committal in our assessment on this. I don't know what exactly is going on, but there are a few different kind of lines of intrigue that I could imagine, at least.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right here. And one thing that points in the direction of him, he might be calculating that if he says and does what he did today, does it loudly enough, somehow Putin will hear about it. Because remember, Putin doesn't use the internet.
Yeah.
Putin doesn't, at least he pretends not to know a lot of the current events. He gets his information from little manila folders that his underlings put on his table. So Prigozhin might have been offering Putin a way to shift the blame for this, even though he's been saying it for a while now, but kind of a desperate action that says, if you just cut Shoigu and Gerasimov and say they're the ones who caused this less than successful operation. They're not ready to accept defeat, but I mean, he certainly sees an opening to say, well, first of all, he has the Bakhmut victory under his belt, and so maybe that's the calculus. Okay, remove Shoigu. It's hard to see, for me at least, that Shoigu would be replaced by Prigozhin. Prigozhin has no institutional weight whatsoever. He's seen by the military as just a criminal.
Sure.
I mean, I don't think you have to have to in order to be able to command an army, even in a very weird place like Russia now. You cannot just be a guy who commands some kind of paramilitary force and who was a criminal before. You will not get the respect. You will not be able to manage those troops and send them to battle and so forth. So I don't know. I mean, Prigozhin is not. I mean, he's obviously ambitious. He's not stupid. Um, but there are so many variables here, and there are so many judgment calls that have to be made right now without complete information that that's maybe where his limitations are right now. But yeah, absolutely right. In the next few days, it's fascinating. Things will unfold, and we'll know what happened. So
Definitely. Yeah, there are a couple other. I'll just leave those for now. So does someone else want to jump in here, and I'll bounce off what they have to say? Obvious, you haven't spoken yet.
Yeah, for sure, mate. No, some really good analysis in the last half hour. It's really, Boris, you got a really good, sound understanding of the situation, far more than I could ever input. But my little tip, why didn't Putin go all in on Ukraine in 2014? If his inclination to war, it wasn't his first inclination to use armed conflict to resolve the situation. Why did he go into Ukraine? Is it 2021? End of 2021? What was the trick? Yeah. Why would he have done that then and not in 2014? That's if his inclination, that was just speculation in my head, and in my mind, I think Putin is a liberal in the Russian system. He's trying to prevent all this Russian ethno-nationalism from pushing out into.
Yes.
And he was unsuccessful. He couldn't prevent the war, so he thought, well, we'll do it, but we'll let all these people. This is speculation on my part, but we'll go into and we'll let all these people die. And if we win, that's good for me. That's cool. But if it's a long drawn out conflict, well, I'm going to get rid of all my political opposition in that way as well. So it's just speculation on my part, Richard. But it's something to consider. And this Wagner group, I don't know, but very oddly named, as you said at the start of the thing. And maybe they're there. Maybe these people are ethno-nationalists and they want what they want, and this could very well spiral.
I think they're more likely to be convicted pedophiles and complete maniacs with a penchant for sadism. I think that's more likely than they're fans of the composer Richard Wagner or the Russian patriots.
Well, the Grugmine nationalism is still nationalism, Richard, and it'd be very silly to underestimate the power of that, because, as you know, Russia is a pretty is the average IQ of Russia 95 or something like that. So this stuff resonates with people. Like, it's not a joke.
Let me go back to this with Boris. So there is this question of why amass troops at the border of Ukraine in the winter of 2021, and maybe why not earlier. So Yanukovych won election, and he in 2014, and he apparently won it fair and square with the help of our good buddy Paul Manafort, and he was turned into it's. I would recommend that you go and watch some of his campaign ads from the time. It's like Paul Manafort turned him into Mike Pence or something. It's very funny. It's all of the aesthetics and sloganeering of American conservatives were just shipped over to Ukraine. It's interesting. But anyway, he won that election, presumably fair and square. And he immediately pulled Ukraine out of a economic deal with EU and was pushing towards a economic deal with Moscow. And this sparked the Maidan and some chaos and a change of leadership. Yanukovych eventually fled. And then there was, while, again, correct me if I'm wrong here on any of the facts, but while Ukraine was dealing with this chaos, there was a kind of bloodless annexation of Crimea where Russian troops, who I believe were in unmarked uniforms, effectively marched into Crimea. It was eventually annexed. You had, serious ambiguity and partisan battles that have been waging for a long time on the in the Donbass region and all that kind of stuff. But why now? I mean, it's interesting. Trump said these things like, if I were president, he never would have invaded. I think Boris would have joked, if Trump were president, he wouldn't have needed to invade. He would have just ridden off Ukraine to Putin or handed it to him on a silver platter or something. Might be true. There's also the possibility that a couple of things. There's kind of like personal reasons of Putin is getting older. He's just had the COVID experience, a lot of time alone. He's seemingly some sort of hypochondriac, or at least someone who's very fearful of assassination. We've seen all these images of him sitting at a table that was like that scene from Batman from 1989, where they're at this huge table at other ends and they have to yell at each other. Could you pass the wine? It's pretty funny. But there might have been some personal reasons for him to write this essay on the unity of the Ukrainian Russian people. I think you could also suggest that he felt that at post-Afghanistan, that the West was losing resolve and was chaotic. I mean, you could also suggest that after getting out of Afghanistan, the West was able to focus again on a European conflict. But anyway, those are just some thoughts of mine. What do you think? I mean, I am interested in this question of why, because the status quo of having annexed Crimea and then having this, that the partisan warfare in Donbass was certainly not to anyone's liking, but it could certainly last and maybe even out and solidify. But why would he do this action in late 2021? What provoked him? What do you think about that, Boris?
Sure. I think there is kind of intrinsic logic that personalist regimes like Putin's kind of follow, and they go from less paranoid to more paranoid, and things happen along the way. Like, remember every time there is a domestic loss of popularity, even though it's not very obvious to like observers outside Russia, the trajectory of Putin's rule was and has been to hollow out the increasingly larger parts of the economy, and essentially divided into sinecures for his cronies, and the largely private sector based economy at the end of Yeltsin's terms. Around 75% of the GDP was produced in the private sector. Now it's flipped, basically. It's over 3/4 state or quasi-state or state-affiliated companies. And obviously with that comes greater dependence on mineral exports and so forth. So there is this incredibly lopsided nature of the Russian economy, where majority of the money that is made finds its way into Moscow, to some extent St. Petersburg, maybe a small handful of larger cities. The rest of the country is truly third world, with just rotting infrastructure, kind of more predatory and less capable local, municipal and regional governments as those economies, with the exception perhaps of a handful of regions where natural resources are mined and extracted, and they get some portion of that rent that is earned, but a lot of provincial areas are kind of sinking deeper and deeper into economic decrepitude. So the logic of that kind of a regime is you have to compensate that with victories, real or perceived, achieved kind of on the outer perimeter of the empire. Basically, you have to say, well, you're not living as well as you did 10 years ago because it's the fault of Russia's external enemies, and they're trying to take your stuff away from you. They're trying to encroach. They're trying to surround you with NATO military bases. They're trying to come and exploit your riches, or your natural resources and so forth. And we have to tighten our belts, and and at some point this philosophy and this logic, I mean, it acquires enough of a people believing in it that it kind of takes on a life of its own. And this, the invasion in February 24th of last year was clearly Putin's idea, but Obvious made a very good point, a pretty obvious point as well. Why didn't he do it in 2014? And it's a very good question, because in 2014, if he did it, he would have likely taken Kiev in a small number of days, maybe not 3 days, but a couple of weeks, definitely. Because at that time, Ukraine was not ready, didn't have an army. Government was much less capable. They didn't have the benefit of 8 years fighting experience in the Donbass. I mean, what happened in Donbass from 2014 until the war, the full-scale invasion was launched, really served Ukraine very well in a kind of a ironic way, because it was essentially a cancer in the body of Ukraine. There were, that region was descending into African-style kind of permanent civil conflict, and it didn't even start out that way, because there were, before 2014, before Russia really got involved and started shipping déclassé elements and weapons to that region, at best there was some discontent among the ethnically Russian speaking population with the rest of the Ukraine's effort to make Ukrainian language kind of more prevalent, or perhaps even on par. I mean, I see Kurt Doodle here. He used to live in Kiev, and I visited Kiev. I never lived there, but Kiev was a Russian-speaking city. Yeah. Maybe parts of Western Ukraine were kind of more. There were some issues with Ukrainian being the dominant and Russian not being encouraged, but the rest of Ukraine didn't give much thought to it. But at the same time, the real violent stuff only started happening when Russia started supplying weapons and started shipping, criminals and volunteers and people who are kind of essentially LARPers, who kind of like Strelkov or Girkin, who are dreaming of reconstructing the Russian Empire, and that's not even the Soviet Union. It's the Russian Empire before 1917. And there was a contingent of people who thought the same way, and they saw that they thought that Donbass was a launching pad for this new conquest, so to speak. And so there was a hodgepodge of different elements that kind of came together there. But so just a little longer than I was hoping. But to answer your question, Richard, I think there isn't a specific single reason why Putin launched it in 2022 and not several years earlier, but it kind of followed everything else. I mean, the confrontation, not domestic, but you have to have an external enemy. You have to indoctrinate your own population to basically deflect their attention from your domestic failures or decreasing popularity. Also, something that is not often discussed, when you have someone in power for 22 years as of the date of the invasion, regardless of performance, people just get tired of you.
Yeah.
So you have to come up with reasons why you are the only one who can perform the role and there's no replacement and so forth. And oftentimes it kind of tends to be external enemy. And I'm the only one who can protect you. So
right. All right. Let me go down the line here. So I'll do Xbox and then Bob Jones and then Sentinel and then Yadolf and then Jessica. So Xbox, you're up first.
Sure. Yeah. So I had two things I wanted to touch on. One is why February 2022 as the time for the invasion. Another was a point that we discussed earlier about Wagner and kind of blame shifting or shifting blame for the poor conduct of the invasion onto Shoigu. So the first point on the February 22nd invasion, I mean, this might be an unpopular thesis here, because I'm just going to blame the West, but there's an article in the National Interest that came out last year, I think it was during the summer, that compiled a lot of evidence for this thesis, that Putin was prompted by the prospect that there was a very narrow window in which he could resolve the conflict on terms favorable to Russia, after which Ukraine would be prepared by arms buildups from the West to retake Donbass and possibly Crimea as well. So I think in 2014, there was a real possibility of escalation over the conflict in Ukraine, but the Obama administration was actually somewhat dovish. And they held back hawks like McCain and Graham from supplying Ukraine with offensive weaponry. The Republican Party was very hawkish on Russia in 2014 and 2015. And the Trump administration, of course, was not particularly concerned with Ukraine, generally wanted positive relations with Russia, but was also more committed to the pivot to Asia that characterized Clinton's the first Obama term interest in shifting American resources from Europe and the Middle East to balancing against China. But the Biden administration, by contrast, is full of really hardcore Atlanticists, people who think that Europe is absolutely central to some kind of rules-based international order, and they're deeply ideologically committed to NATO and these transatlantic institutions that they think is threatened. Also, obviously, there's kind of post-2016 ideological interests in confronting Russia to do with the 2016 election. So there's some evidence that is compiled in this National Review article that the Biden administration was working in 2021, the year prior to the special military operation, to assist in training and arming the Ukrainian military with the intention to retake Donbass and eventually, in distant future, Crimea. So that evidence is inconclusive. A lot of it involves the Biden administration arming Ukraine with drones. There's an interest in actually looking to the Azerbaijan-Armenian conflict as evidence that drone-based warfare could be used drones could be used in an innovative way in kind of trench warfare that had come to characterize fighting in eastern Ukraine. So I think that may have prompted the idea that there's this very narrowing window in which the conflict could be settled on pro-Russian terms favorable to Russia. And that Ukraine was preparing for some kind of major offensive. Now, Prigozhin actually denied that in one of the videos that came out the other day. He says In the lead up to the invasion, there was no intensification of conflict in the Donbass border region. But I think that's not true. At least there's strong evidence that there was a substantial uptick in Ukrainian mortar strikes from like October of 21 until February 2022. But that's one suggestion about why the invasion is not completely arbitrary. Obviously, you can think whatever you want about the justice of the conflict, whether Putin is acting defensively or if Ukraine has a right to retake these territories. But I think that there's some strategic thinking behind this. And really quick, the other point I wanted to make concerning Wagner. So you kind of joked earlier that Wagner's full of all these psychopathic pedophiles and serial killers, and a lot of them are like they are kind of. I do get the impression that Wagner troops are kind of the scum of the earth. But Anatoly Karlin, who is a kind of black-pilled Russian nationalist, made some interesting observations on this. You were also talking about how Putin is a very kind of stale, boring KGB bureaucrat. The Wagner has cultivated this strange kind of internal ideology of like hardcore Russian nationalism that makes them compelling to the public in a way that Putin might not be especially inspiring, or Shoigu, or any of these other gray, drab figures. So it's kind of odd then that like Prigozhin is framing his push or putsch or coup or whatever, simultaneously saying that the war was based on lies, it was this disaster, and it's kind of strangely liberal sounding, getting a lot of support from like the Ukrainian government has been joking about this all day on social media. But on the other hand, saying we'll return to the front lines and prosecute an even more vicious war against the Ukrainians.
Right.
So it's a strange ideological incoherence that I think kind of typifies Russian politics in general, but also like Wagner itself. Like if you check like Wagner Telegram channels, they're all talking about how they'll put in power some kind of military dictatorship, really viciously prosecute a war against the Ukrainians. So that's kind of odd. Karlin thinks that like one of the advantages of the Wagner group and one of the weaknesses of Putin is that Putin kind of let all of these nationalist forces loose with the outbreak of the war, but he's kind of ideologically drab, uninspiring figure, so he can't kind of channel them in a way that makes coherent sense. He's fighting this limited war where you don't have massive mobilized reserves, but the ideological campaign implies this is the great patriotic war we're fighting against the Nazi West or whatever.
Right.
So 2 points that first on the February 22nd invasion and why it occurred then, and second about Wagner's strange ideological position.
These are good points. Yeah, I've read. Thankfully, Anatoly Karlin has no longer blocked me. Apparently, when I waved the Ukrainian flag, that was a little too much for him, and he blocked me. But he's now allowed me back into his good graces. So I am very happy with that. Yeah, I mean, I disagree with Karlin on plenty of things, but I also agree with you. He is he's a black-pilled Russian nationalist, but he's also been wrong in very key areas, but he was also right. I remember him calling the war while everyone else on Twitter, everyone else on pro-Russian Twitter and the pro-Russian media were loudly declaring that an invasion of Ukraine is an impossibility. And why is the West doing this? All of this. This is the kind of Jackson Hinkle, Caleb Maupin, type people, or Haas or whatever. They were all thumping this line. And Karlin was actually right in the sense that he said, I think that Putin now wants to become a great man of history, and he is going to do this. The buildup is real, the threat is real, et cetera. He was right about that. Now, he was also very wrong in the sense that he thought that it would be over in 2 weeks and there would be show trials and Zelensky would be hanged or whatever. Definitely wrong on that. But, the fact that he is black-pilled shows that he's using his critical capacity and he's not just doing propaganda for Russia, which something that I wouldn't say about all of these other kind of Russian shills, from as low as Jackson Hinkle to as high as David Sachs or whatever. So, I think that is That is all. That's all accurate. I do think that the mercenaries themselves probably are lowlifes, but you are right. Like this gets to the point that I was making, my big picture point 30 or 45 minutes ago, in the sense of we are so used to as contemporary Americans to a hyper polarized, hyper politicized society that I think at this point it's kind of hard for us to even imagine a depoliticized society. You know, whenever if you ever go like out to dinner with someone, like don't talk about politics or sex, religion at the dinner table, whatever the rule is. But like, you'll kind of figure out where they stand after about 5 or 15 minutes. And I think it's something very, everyone's in the game. Everyone has an opinion on this. And I think that's just very different in Russia, where it's about outsourcing politics to someone else so that you don't have to think about it and you can just deal with the mundane struggles of daily life. And so I don't know. I mean, Wagner would be entering that type of society. It's not like Russia is an actually fascist society where, Mussolini is putting people in uniform and getting them out at rallies and holding up knives in a center of Florence or something like that. I mean, it's not like Putin is not a fascist in that sense. He's obviously an autocrat, but that is something very different. So it might very well be true that Prigozhin offers this, wild Russian revanchism or imperialism and just general badassery, but whether that is going to take is a question. I mean, it might might go down like a lead balloon. But anyway, let me just go down
Hey,
the
Richard,
line. Yeah,
would you
sure.
mind if I interject for this will be my last point. Okay. The other speaker mentioned the Azerbaijan, was it Armenian conflict? Was it in 2021?
Yeah, the Karabakh.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, I didn't know but at the time it was kind of portrayed as this localized conflict and it was over borders and not wasn't really considered. I didn't conceive it in a geopolitical thing, but that's in the Caucasus, is that right? So Azerbaijan is like I think they're more on the side of NATO. Is that correct?
Right, the United States was backing the
Yes. So put that in the political context now in 2023. Are we going to see a push by NATO into the Caucasus, like a redone of Case Blue of 1941? It's something that's I've been joking on Twitter, making little funny tweets about it. But it seems like that's where they're going with this thing. Like if NATO was to take all of Ukraine, we could be in 10 years, NATO might be pushing into the Southern Caucasus to take Russia's oil or something like that. Certainly, that would be a cause for, they say it's a cause for nuclear war, but there's drone strikes and Ukrainian nationalists going into Russia and hitting up Russia proper now. So look, Russia's weak. Russia's weak.
I agree that Russia is weak. No, I would say this. I think that there is a general fear of any sort of regime change or revolutionary change to Russian society in the West. It's such a big bite to take, basically, that you can go in and establish hegemony and change the economy and change society in the Baltic states or something like this. But the idea of doing this to a nuclear power Russia, I think, is basically conceived of as impossible, which is why there was a tremendous amount of economic, the shock therapy treatment from David Sachs or Jeffrey Sachs or whichever Sachs it was back in the 90s, but there wasn't really a fundamental change to the government order. And I think looking back on things, the continuity seems to stand out. I mean, again, I don't think Putin's a fascist. I don't think properly understood, and I don't think he's a communist either. But isn't it remarkable that they're kind of slouching into effectively a state-run society in his regime? It's
Mm.
absent any Marxism, they're just becoming communist in the sense that the government owns the economy.
Well, that people on right-wing Twitter used to stylize Putin as this neo-Tsar figure, but
Yeah,
everyone forgot what happened to the last Tsar, like a failed military expedition, and what happened at the end. So
yeah.
yeah, it's
But
on the
just to go
cards.
back
But
to what it is, like I'm sure there are people suggesting that this is the ultimate 4D chess move. Prigozhin is working with Ukraine or working with the United States government, and we're sending him in there to take down Russia and spread chaos. Although that is a fascinating theory, I simply don't believe it's the case. I think that Russia is 140 million people, but it's just this massive landmass with various regions, nuclear weapons, etc. I feel like the West does not. That's just too. They don't want to bite off more than they can chew. The idea of you know tearing it to pieces or doing a Saddam Hussein style regime change and installing democracy or something, particularly after the experience most recently with Afghanistan and just handing it back over to the Taliban and Iraq as a failed state, as Libya, et cetera. I don't think they want to do that to Russia. That is my assessment of them. But I, of course, might be wrong. We might find out that this was the most brilliant 4D chess move in world history, but I seriously doubt
mm,
that.
w-
Um,
w- yeah, I'll make one last point and I'll go. Very very short one. It seems they want a detente with China, but they're going hard on Russia. So
yeah,
it's not off the cards. Like they might want to pull apart Russia as a warning to China, but I don't know. But
that's
yeah, I'll let someone else speak now. Yeah. Thanks,
an
Richard. Thanks.
interesting speculation. Yeah, sure. All right, I'll just go down the line here. So Bob Jones.
Hi. So within Russia, you have white nationalist and far right groups that can be called pro-Western, because basically they don't want a Russian empire. They think a Russian empire is too multicultural, and that a stronger for the what would be better for the Russian people ethnically would be a Russia with smaller borders. And they don't want to interfere with like Western geopolitical interests. So what sort of role, yeah, obviously it'll be a post Putin future. What sort of role do you think these kinds of far right white nationalists but pro Western forces in Russia, what role will they play in this post Putin future? Like how popular will they be, um, and will they be a serious political force? And do you think that they can take advantage of events right now like this coup? So for example, I think there were these two like groups led by this man named Kapustin, that or something like that were fighting. They're like within Russia's borders right now. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's what I wanted to ask if that makes sense.
I tend to say that they won't have any effect at all. I mean, Putin probably wants to inspire white nationalism to at least some degree in the West, but he does not want that at all in his home front, and he has actually seriously oppressed those people. Um, Even the reformer kind of opposition leader
Nalvani.
Navalny was. I mean, I think it would be wrong to call him a white nationalist, but he certainly was talking about immigration and foreigners and crime. I mean, he was hitting all the notes, even if exactly who he is, I think is questionable. But I don't see that. I could see some hardcore Russian nationalists fighting against Russia as they have been. I mean, there's that interesting incursion that happened not too long ago. But the again, they're speaking to a depoliticized populace. I just don't think this kind of thing will take. And I don't think, and certainly if Russia is just soundly defeated, and the West actually has to go in and start to build up a new state, I obviously seriously doubt they would work with them. Although they did work with them in Ukraine. So interesting question. All right, Sentinel, you've got the floor. Sentinel.
Gotcha. Thank you, Richard. One thing earlier that was mentioned was sort of this question of like why Putin didn't just go in during 2014 and take it. And I think that I think in viewing any kind of current events or any political situation anywhere, we tend to forget the effect of like the passage of time. So we're in 2023, and that was in 2014, and I think if you look at it from the Kremlin's perspective and their calculus, I think true Ukraine only had 6,000 soldiers at that point, and they couldn't really be effectively organized into a coherent fighting force. But at the same time, you have the Donbass war, and you have Russia's reluctance to throw in with groups like the DPR and the LNR in a political way. Like, sure, they provided covert support to them, but you also have to remember that people like Shrelkov and aspects of Russian society that were very loudly pro DNR were arrested in some cases, or were censored at least. And so I think the passage of time and the codification of this more radical nationalist element within Ukraine and the buildup of the Ukrainian military, I think, probably had a pretty big effect on their desire to go to war over the issue. Whereas in Ukraine, if you're Putin and you're looking at that situation in the era of Obama and the early Syrian war, and the U.S. still very involved with deployments elsewhere, I think if you're in Putin's shoes, given how Putin is very protective of okay, we don't want chaos, we don't want to empower these populist type movements. He's very safe in that regard. And I think that if you look at it from his perspective, Ukraine really isn't much of a threat. I mean, they're beating each other up in the parliament, and they're doing all these things. And then you fast forward to 2 years ago, and you have an armed and militarized Ukraine that has violated or disregarded the Minsk agreements. And I'm not speaking for either side. I'm just sort of looking at this from sort of their perspective. You have NATO getting more involved in Ukraine, and I think that probably had a bigger impact as to we need to go in and we need to nip this in the bud now, as opposed to waiting. And the only other point I would make, I think, is that I've been my dad he was in the U.S. Army, and I was talking to him about this earlier, about this Prigozhin stuff. And we were just talking about how Prigozhin flaps his wings quite a lot and has made these, we had the whole, where the shells Shoigu thing, and we've had all this stuff. And I think that either this is the big one and something actually does happen, and there's videos that are unconfirmed of fighting right now.
I saw those, yeah.
I'm sure those will come to light soon, but either it will be something big will happen, or within 24 hours this will be all wrapped up and we'll be talking about Tu-95s launching cruise missiles at Kiev or something else. Because there's this in this war, there's all these moments that are, oh, this is big, this is the big one, and then it's we're more concerned with who blew what up where and that kind of thing. Right. So I think that's sort of important to keep in mind, because as you said yourself, the depoliticization of society, if this happened in the US, we'd lose our damn minds. But at the same time, the existence of something like Wagner in the U.S. is not something that we can easily fathom, and I just don't. I think that this
we
could.
Lost our damn minds over J6. I mean,
Yeah.
And that was utter. I mean, I think that was in a weird way a coup, but it was a buffoonish as hell coup. This, at least ostensibly, is very real. And Prigozhin is going to go down in a blaze of glory and be destroyed, or we actually are seeing something, as you said, this might be the big one, where we see a power struggle in in Moscow, as opposed to just kind of frontline movements in Ukraine. It's very, very possible.
Yeah, for sure. And Richard, my final just question to you, and I don't know how much you focus on sort of the military nitty gritty of like what's going on at the front, but I've sort of been thinking, I wonder what will happen at the front as a result of this, or will the Ukrainians make gains? And I kind of tend to think that it won't happen as much, just because if you're a soldier, you're not just going to move. But do you think there'll be any changes in the strategic situation, or do you think it'll remain the same? But that's all I got.
Yeah, good question. I kind of don't know if this will directly affect the frontline situation. At least not immediately. Obviously, chaos in Russia's capital will start to affect it hugely, but I think it's the time being. I don't think this will affect the military situation. I think it's removed from it. All right. Well, thank you, Sid. And all you had some good points to make. Okay, I will go to Kalind Panwar.
Thanks for having me on the show. So we are talking about Ukraine crisis and going on, and we have to know what are the current situation right now. So here we have one side, Russia, which has been supported by some nations. Moreover, it's likely BRICS, Iran, India, China. These are some countries in this group, and the other side we have NATO, which is kind of giving Ukraine the equipments needed to fight the war. So it's simple that West is funding the war, and the Western narrative is clear that we have to fight the war, and can see the situation that Ukraine is being funded by the West, and the Russia is being funded somehow by the alliance, which has not been told. It is kind of between more of like between Iran and China. Russia is using Shahid drones, which are from Iran, and there is kind of more of ammunition from China being supplied in the border regions, which is not being told, and it is kind of secret deal. And there is NATO, which has been Ukraine, with the Ukraine being funded, but real terms, the West is declining in geopolitical arena, and the East is rising. And what I mean by East and West is not geographical terms. It is kind of more of like a geopolitical term right now, because geopolitics have paved the way right now in this Ukraine crisis. And here we have some nations which are
Okay.
rising geopolitically, such as Saudi, Iran, Indonesia, and India. Kind of China is declining. Moreover, if you analyze it in a longer term, as the population of China is declining, and
Okay.
Russia.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Do we want to talk more about this? Pat, you've had your hand up for a while. Go for it.
Yeah, how you doing, Richard?
Doing well.
My kind of thing is that you're hearing things from like Mearsheimer and all them that Russia may win in the end, but Russia's already lost, and they don't really understand that because the Russian youth has been destroyed. I mean, like 100,000 people dead. I mean, for a country with the birth rate of Russia and like an age pyramid that's like almost like an inverted triangle, that's pretty damaging. And even if they do win like some borderlands, that it will be very hard to keep down, militarily. It's not going to do nothing for them. And the rest of their youth all scurried off, like Turkmenistan, Georgia, and all that. So Russia is already lost. It doesn't really matter what happens in Ukraine. So, and we're going to see more of this because the problem is that Putin is now delegitimized, by this really geopolitical failure of the greatest order. And but we really can't conceive of a modern Russia without Putin. I mean, Putin is modern Russia. And I think that this is kind of the big picture we need to look at is that what does a Russia look like without Putin? And I can't really see it as anything other than just like a chaotic mess in essence. And the fact that it has over like thousands of warheads really would put the entire world's eyes to this. So I think really what needs to happen now, especially with this happening, is that the United States and China has to put their foot down and say, you know what, this is getting too dangerous. We don't want to have a country with this level of nuclear capabilities, just fall into disorder like this. So I want to see something with the Biden administration kind of going forward for this. Like, the adults need to come to the room and just, put an end to this, including Z. But anyways,
Yeah. Um, one thing real quick on the demographic situation. Russia has gone through this for about the last 100 years. These terrible losses in the Great War and the Russian Civil War and then World War II. They have always had this, tremendous loss of young men, basically, for much of the 20th century. I don't think they even recovered by the 21st from just the devastation of the 20th century. Not in terms of people, but in terms of just the demographics, as you say. I actually read a very interesting work on this that had some just shocking statistics in terms of the deaths in battle men between the ages of 16 and 35. That is the prime years when you're likely to get married and all of that kind of stuff and have children. It is a serious thing. So they've gone through this before. One thing I just I just pushed my space window down, and there are video of Wagner forces surrounding the Ministry of Defense with tanks. Now, these are unconfirmed, but what time is it? How is Russia is 9 hours ahead, or what is it? 9 hours ahead of the East Coast, or 7 hours? So it's early morning there. Is that correct? These images are startling. I think it's very clear that this coup is real. Okay, let's go to Halvation, and then we'll get some of the other people who requested here.
Thank you for letting me speak, Richard.
Sure.
I'm surprised no one so far has mentioned the possibility of Lukashenko losing his grip on power in Belarus since he's so tied to the Kremlin.
Yeah,
Already
big
there have been.
fans. What do you think, man? What does Team Zog think about just being triple the fuck?
Oh my god, these guys are just so terrible. I'll just block this guy. They're still obsessed with the vax, but anyway, go ahead, Halvation. You were speaking about
Anyway,
Belarus. Yeah.
yes, yes. Already there have been movements within Belarus to topple Lukashenko and get closer to the West. So I don't know. I think a power vacuum might just rip open with this whole situation. Belarus might end up orbiting the West if Putin can't hold on to power in Moscow.
Very true. There was actually a rumor put. I just saw this on Twitter today. Take this with a grain of salt, but there was a rumor that oh gosh, who's the leader of Belarus again? Remind me real quick.
Lukashenko.
That his plane, his private plane, has actually taken off. That he might be fleeing the country.
Oh, damn.
Unconfirmed rumor, but they were using just flight records similar to this people who were harassing Elon about his plane flights. So yes, I mean there was a serious effort, a kind of Maidan writ small in Belarus before the war that Russia helped to put down using propaganda vehicles. There is, I mean, I can't even keep up with all of the details about this, but it's, Belarus is going to be, they're going to launch troops from Belarus. It's going to be they're going to launch nuclear weapons from Belarus. I mean, all of this kind of stuff. Clearly, Putin sees Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia as one people. They need to be united in a unitary state.
Yeah,
And
I agree.
yeah.
I remember hearing about plans by 2030 of Russia to annex Belarus.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard anything about that?
Yes, I've seen all of these things. I don't quite know what to make of them, but it also goes in line with Putin's own historical ideological conception of the unity of the Slavic people. So it's not terribly surprising.
Hmm.
But
So we shall
yes,
see.
all of these things, I mean,
Oh,
these dominoes can start falling, and
yeah.
you start losing all of your tried and true support, and you start looking weak, and then it's over. I mean, I don't think we should just overestimate all of this, but I don't think we should dismiss it as well.
N-
I mean, if these images are to be believed, there are, wow. Yes, so this is one. This is Alexander Vindman. So this guy who was involved with all the impeachments of Trump. He's posted something. Wagner troops are entering the SMD HQ.
Yeah, I've been
Wow.
seeing some of the footage. It is incredible, but there's also a lot of confusion. Some people say it's the Russian National Guard and not Wagner.
He just explicitly said it's not the Russian National Guard. I
Hmm.
don't want to, again, I don't take anything I say as fact. I'm just seeing these things right now, but this seems extremely serious what we are witnessing. Whew. All right, let's do this. Is there someone who hasn't spoken? Victor, you spoke. Yeah, Victor spelled backwards.
Hello, Richard Spencer. We've talked before. I asked you a question about Christopher Hitchens because you had told a story about having met him at
Yeah,
I think, a Christmas party or something. Um,
yeah.
yeah, I guess you don't remember. Um,
No, I remember telling that story, but go ahead.
okay, yeah. Anyways, so I guess what I wanted to ask is, how likely is it that like other parts of the Russian like military align themselves with the Wagner group, and also I guess it's it seems that it was a little bit I don't know, crazy for the Wagner group to try to launch this coup without having any sort of institutional backing or support. And I guess that the last question I wanted to ask you is, how likely is it that like Ukraine, advances into Crimea? Either
Well, I mean, okay, I'll just go over a few of those. I mean, I don't even want to speculate about whether Russian forces will join up with the Wagner group. I mean, that would express extreme demoralization, and
sure.
also a kind of ideological, what's the right word, vehemence. I mean, you're getting paid and being protected by being a member of the Russian military. Are you just gonna, on a dime, turn and kill your superior officers and march on Moscow? I mean, that just seems like a huge bar to jump over. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think Prigozhin would have to do something extremely dramatic if for something like that to occur. In terms of striking Crimea, I mean, this has been a major thing. I mean, Russia has sent out signals. Now, granted, the Kremlin will say all sorts of bombastic nonsense, but they have sent out signals that an attack on Crimea with NATO or American weapons would be considered a direct conflict, because this will not just be the U.S. supplying Ukraine, which is a kind of victim. This would be an aggressive attack onto what is considered to be Russian territory, and they would consider that an act of war. And again, you hear all sorts of stuff coming out of the Kremlin, but it seems like you should take that fairly seriously. I do think that they would see that as a red line. I mean, the losing territory that you possessed a decade ago, that would be shocking and demoralizing.
Yeah, but it was. No, like up until the invasion, it was. I guess people from my part of the aisle that we said that Russia would not go to war, just because of the fact, we saw that the Russian army was never going to be up to the task. So it was like, well, the best they can do is it's a foolish move. The best they can do is maybe a stalemate at best.
Wow, with you guys saying
and
that, I heard a lot of Russia's and they don't believe in conquest and
I think that's sort of a mega communist argument that you're making.
Okay,
But that's
well, you're
not
not MAGA
serious.
communist. Okay,
That's not a serious. No, those aren't serious people.
okay. And what I read as well from right-wing independent analysts was that Russia was this amazing military force and is going to just bulldoze Ukraine. And to be honest, I believe that. I am not an expert in these things. I just believed it. I also thought that this was going to be a pretty devastating event when it first unfolded.
Well, so my
yeah.
my thinking was that Russia wouldn't do it because they would obviously be rolled back by American, Eurozone, and other Eastern European rivals of Russia. So like it just seemed like
Well, I think they might have presumed to at least some degree that NATO wouldn't actualize itself in this regard. I mean, obviously Ukraine's not a member of NATO, at least at the moment, and that what would Trump have done if this had happened under his watch? It's an interesting question. I think you could go both ways because Trump is so mercurial and emotional. I mean, you could see him like you could make a plausible argument that he would nuke Moscow, and you can also make a plausible argument that he would sign off Ukraine to Russia, depending on his mood or the last person who spoke with him.
I think
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I think Trump would. I mean, Trump says that he would say outrageous things. Like it seemed like it was like to distract from like other issues that could actually harm him politically.
Yeah. Let me ask you a few questions. So you are. I was just reading your bio. You're an anti-imperialist, and so are you? How do you consider yourself? You consider yourself on the left, or?
I think I would still. I think it's sort of a sentiment, like it's like a sentimentality. I have an attachment to that label.
Okay.
I was as a child, I was like a conservative. I got into politics because my parents were like Fox News, like whatever.
Interesting.
So I just didn't find conservatives very compelling, very interesting, or very intelligent. So Christopher Hitchens for me was like a discovery that like I could kind of like develop a new ideology, and he taught me to develop a sense of history, a sense of irony, and to try to find nuance in like your worldview.
Yeah. What do you think of MAGA communism? What is this grouping of seemingly totally incompatible ideals? So, with someone like Jackson Hinkle, let's just use him as an example. So he's this kid, kind of a bright young kid from California. At least that's how he looks. And then he was a self-described Marxist-Leninist, although I have no idea what that even means for someone like him. And then there's this adoption of all of this MAGA stuff. Like I did a space like a week ago, and there was a guy who I actually kicked him off the space because he was just annoying. But I looked at his profile, and it was like MAGA communists and so on. And he was stressing over and over. He was like, the vaccine, gay rights, they do this because they're evil. They're evil. They're trying to kill us all. Like it's this real strong, like Manichaean Christian moralism, and you can see that in some of Putin's statements where he's dropped the S word in terms of Satanism and so on. So it's this just seemingly bizarre concoction of people professing to be Marxist-Leninist and then at the same time being like QAnon. I mean, it's just I never would have imagined that such a formulation would ever take place. But what are your thoughts on all this? Because I imagine you're closer to it than I am.
Well, I mean, I guess there are like factions of the left that kind of do try to attach to like a social conservatism that I think there was a Patrick Buchanan. I think when he ran for reform, it was Alexander Coburn who I think supported his like candidate, his run for the presidential um, race or whatever. It seems like sort of a dead end. It's interesting, I guess. They can be interesting. They make interesting
But it
arguments.
has appeal to young people, some appeal at least.
Well, because I think also I mean, when I discovered Christopher Hitchens, I also discovered Alexander Coburn. So
Yeah.
for like, if you have young teenage conservatives and they see this, it is sort of it shatters like the worldview, and it kind of it's very powerful. It's very attractive. Um,
Interesting.
but I don't think I think it's sort of a dead end, and I think it's not really um, it's kind of incoherent
Well,
at the end
yeah.
of the day, I think.
I mean, to say the least. Yeah, it's incoherent and a dead end. It's hard to disagree with that when we're talking about MAGA communism, but it is kind of fascinating that these people have gotten somewhere with it, and it seems to
But
have some weird appeal.
I mean, I think you should be able to understand it. I mean, it's Rothbard did, align himself with like certain, factions of the anti-war left movement. I think in the '70s,
Yeah, but that
there was the
I
Ron
guess
Paul, you know,
I guess you're right. I mean, and Rothbard said nice things about David Duke, and then Rothbard would vote for Democrats or support socialists because he thought foreign policy was the preeminent issue for his movement. So yeah, that's rather interesting.
yeah, it's not new. I mean, they also say politics makes rather strange of bedfellows, right? So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, I mean, I guess Jackson Hinkle probably. Um, I think he had a Twitter post where he said that his parents lied to him about the Iraq War, and I kind of get that.
Well, yeah, but his dad chimed in and said you were lying.
I don't believe his dad. I don't believe his dad. I think his dad seems like a pretty much run of the mill conservative. Um,
Okay.
yeah, I've heard someone say something about conservatives where it's like I think it was among like libertarian circles because they were saying I think it was a Rothbard quote who said you have to take these people out of the society. I can't remember the exact quote. And so basically the thinking is that you have to purge like leftists, communists, any kind of socialist, any kind of leftist. And so someone said, well, what about conservatives? And then like they kind of laughed and said, no, conservatives will just conform to any society that they're dropped in. And so they made a joke like conservatives under Stalinism. We have
Right.
we have nationalization and massive socialization because it's tradition, you know.
Yeah, definitely.
So
Definitely.
conservatives are pretty much conformists. They're not really a threat to anything.
Yeah.
I guess, and I think
No,
I'm
I
inclined to
think
agree.
that's very true. I mean, there's no doubt that the late Soviet Union was a kind of conservative regime with Gorbachev as a sort of reformist, true believer. I guess a kind of ironic aspect of him, the true believer brought down the state. Um, yeah, good stuff. Some very good points in this regard. Let me just do two more speakers, and then I will call it quits on this. So I'll go to Yankee first. Yankee Voyager,
Hi, Richard. How's it going?
going well.
Good to hear. I'm just a question to bring up. Like, what's the best scenario for the West here. I mean, obviously we've kind of delved deep into the details of like what's actually happening, but it seems like the Wagner Group is probably the more aggressive ethno-nationalist faction within Russia right now, and even if they're maybe not successful in their coup, maybe it may spur some influences within the Putin circle to will be more aggressive in the war. I just kind of maybe bring that question up, see what other people think about that. Because I just don't see a scenario in which this coup, I don't think it will destabilize Russia enough to have a regime change. I think it may kind of put a fire on the ass of Putin and his cronies to maybe be a little more aggressive. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, when you ask what's better, I mean, it's for who. I might even get Boris's thoughts on this. This is just my impression, is that although the West wouldn't mind some kind of thorn in the side of the Putin regime, the idea of Russia descending into chaos and just having to deal with this massive problem of the largest landmass, sovereign landmass that possesses nuclear weapons and a history and dreams of glory and so on. The prospect of a true regime change in Russia is just too much for them. And maybe, I mean, it was even too much for the United States in the post-Cold War era when they were riding high in a way and felt like they had won the Cold War and all that kind of stuff. So I just don't see them. I don't know. I think this notion that the U.S. is going to go in and carve up Russia and radically reform it, and there's going to be privatization again and of these companies, and women going to college and all the kind of Bush era stuff. I don't think they're going to do this again. But that is just my impression of them. I think they fear that kind of chaos. It might very well come to that, and they might have to deal with a situation that immense. But I don't think it will be of their choosing. I think as Putin has crossed a red line, but they were clearly willing to bash Putin, maybe sanction him here and there, lift the sanctions here and there, but deal with him. And that was certainly what Obama, as a kind of post-George W. Bush candidate, wanted to do. I mean, he was chastising Mitt Romney, the Cold War is over, granddad, Russia's not our chief geopolitical enemy, et cetera. I mean, they wanted to deal with him, and they did not. I mean, they did not make Georgia, for instance, a red line. Relations, in fact, improved after the Georgia situation. So I just don't think they want to deal with Russia in that way. But I'm curious if Boris has an opinion on this.
Sure. I think the fears the West has with regard to a chaos in Russia primarily, at least the rational fears, primarily revolve around the nuclear arsenal.
Yeah.
If you take that away, who cares if Russia falls apart into 10 different fiefdoms? The only fallout of that will be felt, and it will be felt primarily in Europe, is if it becomes a war zone, kind of like Yugoslavia times 20. There'll be a flow of refugees, and there'll be just a lot of problems the Europeans will be facing from that direction. But I am of the opinion that actually even the nuclear fear, when Russia falls apart and there are even less controllable potentates, running their little fiefdoms, and some of them may inherit the nuclear arsenal. I think that fear is the fear of that, specifically with regard to the nuclear weapons, is irrational because it would be easier to deal with many small or a number of small, strong men. Because right now, for instance, that nuclear arsenal is being used as a bargaining chip. Is being used as a threat. You can, I mean, just completely cynically, if you have, 3 or 4 of those little czars, kind of trying to threaten anyone, you can just basically kill them off, or you can buy them off. You can effect precision strikes because intelligence gathering will become easier if you will know exactly where that arsenal is on their territory. So things become a lot easier, and there will be no such apocalyptic vision of if you try to eliminate Russia's nuclear arsenal, then this is mutually assured destruction. There won't be any such thing. And granted, I mean, it's kind of, I mean, if you look at North Korea now, North Korea has successfully blackmailed the rest of the world into providing for it, essentially, into sending food aid. And whenever they start kind of feeling the scarcity, they always launch a new missile, and the West is recoiling and say, okay, and the cycle continues. I mean, there might be some of that in that brave new world hypothetical, but everything I've heard, again, the fear of Russia's dissolution is primarily nuclear.
Yeah.
So
I know, I totally understand that. If Trump gets back in and Putin is hanging on to a Russian rump state with nuclear weapons, Trump will be bragging about, like, we're great friends. He wrote me this letter. I'm going to take it back home with me. I can see that. All right. Let's do this. I think I might just put a bookmark in it here. This was a good discussion. So this is what's happening right now. I mean, I'm just seeing this on Twitter. But Rostov, so this is a logistics hub for the Russian military. How far outside of Moscow is that, or is that in Moscow?
No, Rostov is about, I would say, 700 miles or about 1,000 kilometers south of Moscow.
Oh,
so
okay.
it's not really close, but that would be on the path of Wagner's march toward Moscow. That would generally be
a 10-hour drive.
A 10-hour drive. Okay, interesting. It has been reported that Wagner has liberated Rostov.
I've seen photos in the past few minutes of street fighting in Rostov between Wagner and the regular troops. So
wow,
it does look real. So I mean, there's a lot of contextual details on those photos that, I mean, they appear so quickly. Again, you cannot vouchsafe that it's authentic.
This is it. It looks like the Wagner units are preparing to storm the headquarters of the Russian Southern Military District. They definitely control the streets, and it appears that resistance is zero. Remarkable.
Yeah, well, they certainly, the contingency plans were not drawn for defense of Rostov against Wagner. I'm sure that wasn't in the plans. So,
right.
Not surprised at all that there was no resistance.
Wow. So is Rostov right? Is that on the Sea of Azov?
It's in the kind of in the delta of the Don River, which flows into the Sea of Azov. It's not far. I would probably say wouldn't
Right.
know
So they have
the
just
exact
left.
definition.
Wow, they've just left the front lines. They're going. Well, wow, we are just watching something unfold here. Okay, Victor, you had your hand up real quick. Do you want to say something before we go?
Yeah. I wanted to ask you something completely different. I don't mean it to come off as antagonistic. But I wanted to ask you about you had sort of a like political turn, right? You were very highly critical, I think, earlier in your career of American foreign policy, and now you sort of had this change where now you are, I guess, for American involvement overseas. But what I would say, and this is the antagonistic part, is that it does also seem incoherent because I've seen you in other spaces, and in those spaces you sort of look down and you don't think very highly of like American like values. So I'm not sure why in that case, if that, you would want American spreading of their values overseas. I don't understand that
Well, what are you
calculation.
talking about in terms of American values? Like,
Well, I guess I think I forgot what space it was, but you were saying I'm so sick of this. You were telling someone that like America is shit, the people are shit, and freedom and like whatever, I don't know, whatever American
I'm
values are.
sure I can get a little bit, chippy at times, and I think I was having a discussion with someone who is a self-described socialist, and he was just like, the reason why Americans are dumb is that they don't have proper nutrition, and the corporations are keeping proper nutrition, and so Americans become obese. And I get a little bit tired of hearing these excuses. I guess I have a complicated view on these things. Maybe it is a bit. There are some tensions there.
So I think, well,
but I do think that the West should be united, and this is a very good way to go about it.
Okay, so Christopher Hitchens, like his calculation was that he would prefer a global order under American imperialism because he thinks America hegemony is like the best leader for it, and he doesn't think any other state is up for that task, and he would rather live in a world dominated by the American system than by like a Chinese one, or
well, yeah, I said as much. I mean, I think there are some competing.
So then, what is that?
To a world order,
right? So is it liberal? Is it liberal? Is it liberal values?
I think it is liberal values to some degree, to be honest, and capitalism and all of that. I mean, I get that, but I do think that there is something good in the history of NATO itself, that it was a just cause, it was a just alliance, and it's now refound its raison d'etre with the Ukraine invasion. And that, yes, I would much rather live under liberal values, as kind of off-putting as they can be sometimes, than to live in a Chinese system or a Muslim system, etc. And it's our job. I do think that, I mean, we're in a kind of weird place now where I think you can almost see over the horizon a little bit, and you can see the end of America. But I don't think that we should just like bring that upon us out of spite or something, because what's going to come in its wake will surely be worse. And I don't have any sympathy for the competing paradigms. And the kind of Ron Paul, or even a nationalist, like, nationalism for everyone. We'll all just be little nationalists and not, I don't know, maybe trade with each other at most, but
no, I think I agree with that.
Interconnected family. I find this just hokey,
Right. It's sort of it's sort of like what was it, the world in Seattle when they had those protests in the 90s?
Yeah.
Right. Anti-global. It's yeah. You're kind of pining for a thing that's in the past and won't return.
Yeah. So
Mm.
I think that this is, in a way, the best we got. And there is also a tradition of these structures maintaining themselves while they are innerly transfigured. I mean, I think that's a kind of great hope that someone could have, where the NATO alliance, it arose out of the Berlin crisis long ago. It arose out of these emergencies that we don't even remember anymore. But that structure remains, and that structure can be transformed on an inner level towards something better.
Have you ever talked to Justin Raimondo?
Well, I talked to Justin Raimondo is dead. I don't know if you know that.
Yes, I do know that.
Yeah, he died
we kept
3 or
yeah
4 years ago. Yeah, I mean,
yeah
I
we kept a
actually
small
visited.
correspondence.
It was
Uh-huh.
funny. I was in California. This was back in like 2009, and I was actually in California, and I visited him, and we talked
Oh
a lot.
wow.
It was fairly fun. But no, I liked Justin Raimondo.
Well,
Um,
I don't know if he invented it, but he had this thing on Twitter where he would say, "Invite the world, invade the world." And
mhm.
I think you said something about you want Western Europe to be united. If we're going to have NATO invading the world, then you are inviting the world, and you won't have this. This. I mean, I think
Well, it
if
all
you were if
depends
you
on what the world is you're talking about. I mean, do I want Western nations flooded with Nigerians or something? Obviously not. But in terms of the basic structure of, say, the EU, to use here, the inner migration between European countries, I mean, that just makes sense to me. I mean, we don't live in even in the 19th century. I mean, in the 19 I would say that we don't live it's not the 19th century. That's a wrong analogy. In the 19th century, you could hop on a train and pass between different principalities or states without a passport. I mean, it was very open among people who were Western. That's a good thing. I mean, do these all these borders and currencies and so on, does any of this make sense at this point? I mean, it seems like people hold on to this stuff just purely out of nostalgia.
Yeah, I'm more inclined to try to think of something new. I think do you still have that? Are you still hashing out that ideology of what was it, Hellenistic something, Hellen something?
I don't know if I ever said Hellenistic. I don't know if I ever. I might be wrong.
You
I
you
don't think I ever said that.
you had like a new ideology that you were sort of hashing out. I thought
Oh, you're talking about Apolloism.
Apolloism, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We're hashing that out.
Well,
Yes,
that's
that's right.
exactly. Yeah. That is interesting, I guess. I just think people should try to come up with new things. You know,
Because the old things don't work. Liberals at this point are pulling their hair out and fretting over the rise of fascism or populism or whatever. And they're defending democracy, but they can't even quite explain to you what they're defending outside of the rule of law or something. They're not really asserting a value system. And so, I mean, there's a hollowness towards the West. But I think that kind of thing can be an opportunity. Like you can fill up that hollow vessel at some point. And I think that's the hope for transformation. But I don't see any hope for transformation in just like vaguely raging against any action by the American empire or something like that. I mean, it is what it is. We are ultimately better off for it, and it exists, and it's going to act in certain ways. And I think it's better to just accept that and deal with it than kind of rage against it and yell at this thing, and everything it does is kind of wicked and evil. And I get tired of that kind of stance. I got into that mentality a bit in when I was kind of first reaching political consciousness with the Iraq War stuff, because the Iraq War was a completely awful decision. And
Sure.
but I think you can overestimate that kind of thing and inflate it and start thinking that anything the US does is bad, or that the US empire is kind of inherently wrong or something like that. And I don't believe any of that anymore.
You don't believe that you don't believe imperialism is inherently wrong.
Well, I've never believed that, but no, I think imperialism is inherently good.
Mm-hmm.
Civilization has been advanced through empire. I mean, the nation state exists because of empire. It's this irony.
Sure. There was Christopher Hitchens was once encountered by I guess what he called a European nationalist, or maybe he was just a reactionary. And it was at the time. It was at the time when the when the euro was invented, and and so the guy he meets Christopher Hitchens. I think he's going to interview him, and he says, "So how is your Esperanto coin going?" And I don't know. You must know what Esperanto means, right?
Yeah. It's like invented the perfect language or something. Yeah.
Right. So Christopher Hitchens, he is defending, the euro, like as like from like a leftist like standpoint, but he's troubled by it. He's writing about it, and he's saying like it might fall. The whole project might just die. Have you ever considered that?
Well, if you ask someone, how is your Esperanto coin going? I think the answer would be quite well, thank you. I mean, like I heard a lot of this stuff early on, like the EU is just going to collapse and the euro will go into hyperinflation and we'll be back on the franc and the lira in no time. No one thinks that anymore.
You think we just sludge forward through these crises?
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah. All right, guys, that was a good talk. I'll give you a follow there, Victor. You have a sensitive mind. Hopefully you can come on again. All right, guys.
I would love to. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. There are a few more requests, but I'm going to put a bookmark in it. So I will talk to you all soon, and I look forward to seeing how this fares. Who knows what will happen when we wake up tomorrow morning. All right, I will talk to you later. Bye. Tschüss.